Robert Louis Wilken is the Professor Emeritus of the History of Christianity at University of Virginia. Before that, he taught at Notre Dame and Fordham University and Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg. He's the author of several books, the ones that I was mentioning last night, and we also have, again, for sale today, in case you didn't get to those last night, are The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, and his most recent book is The First 1,000 Years, these three from Yale University Press that we have available here. And his topic for our lunch today is Global Christianity Then and Now. After the lecture, like last night, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A that will take us to about 1 o'clock. So if anybody needs to get away by then, hopefully we'll be wrapping it up about then, but then have time for the rest of us to stay and visit afterwards. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Robert Wilken.
Thank you very much, Keith. Beginning to feel at home here. Had a very nice day yesterday, and a lot of good conversations, and some serious people here who read and think, which is always a joy. And I was asked to do something else, and I wrote this book. It came out a couple of years ago, The First 1,000 Years, which is over there. It's a general history of Christianity up until the year 1000. And I realized as I was writing it, that was not my intention, that it has a lot of implications for world Christianity today. And I've gotten more interested in that aspect of things. But I'm mostly going to talk about the historical material, and then along the way we'll have a few comments that apply to the global world in which Christianity now exists. You know, writing history is a ritual of saving from oblivion those who have gone before. You know, what was just said in our prayer by Jeff. The Polish poet Czesław Miłosz said, "What power preserves what once was if memory does not last?" Because the past doesn't vanish at once. It dies slowly. But if remembered, the dead maintain their ground. So memory is a Christian virtue. Without memory, there is no Christian faith, and there's no passing on of the faith. And of course, in the words of institution, do this in remembrance of me. But it's an essential aspect. And from early on, I mean, the book of Acts, we have a historical book right smack in the New Testament, at the very beginning. But we live in a society in which fewer and fewer people have any investment in the past. And fewer people have much knowledge of the Christian past and have little understanding of what Christianity is. I think that most of the people who write about religion in the newspapers, they're young, they're not religious people, they've had nothing in their own experience or their education. So they come with little to appreciate what Christianity is, and more it becomes just another set of opinions. And that's not what Christianity is, not a set of opinions. And also for the Christians themselves, the only way to know who we are as Christians and to help others know what Christianity is by the act of remembering, by telling the Christian story. But that's the question, how to tell it. How to tell it. For years, I've been asked to recommend a general history of the early church. And quite frankly, I thought that none did the job. One of the main reasons, which is at the core of this book, is that they end too soon. Those of you who have studied church history know that in most cases, the books that were sort of formative end around the 5th or 6th century. They may go a little further than that, but not much. They're also oftentimes too theological. Even though I'm a theologian, I wrote books on theology. And most important, they're too focused on the West. For generations, the history of Christianity has been told as a Western story, that is, in the West. It begins in the Middle East, but it spreads west. And we all have in our libraries, or we see them in church, these maps of Paul's missionary journeys. And they all go west into other parts of the Roman Empire. None have anything about going east. And Jerusalem is in the east, and it is part of a whole culture that is Eastern, Syriac or Aramaic speaking. And then, of course, it goes to Greece and Rome, but then from there it goes north into Latin-speaking, or what became Latin-speaking Western Europe. And then we get the whole story of Western Christianity, Charlemagne, and then the medieval, the popes and the emperors, and then we get to the Reformation, and from the Reformation then you get into the rise of Protestantism, and then, you know, if you go further and further, then you might start to talk about the 19th century, the Enlightenment, and then maybe you might talk about the missions that begin to go to other parts of the world. But it's basically a Western story. And that's the one that I think is probably in most of our hits. Andrew Walls, who's one of the great writers on global Christianity, he says the global transformation of Christianity today, what he means, requires nothing less than the complete rethinking of the church history syllabus. And I think I had not read that passage of Walls when I wrote the book, but I think that's basically what I was out to do, was to try to tell the story in a different way, and to make possible then the later history to be told in a way for it. Now, as we all know, in recent generations, there's been a great flourishing of interest in Byzantine Christianity. We all love the icons. And of course, people who study the early church, they love the Greek-speaking theologians. Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, even Cyril of Alexandria, who I happen to like. Not everybody is a fan of Cyril's. Theodoret of Cyrus said that when he dies, he says, I hope they put a very big stone over his grave so he doesn't come back to haunt us again. And then into the Byzantine church. And so Constantinople then becomes the second focal point of the history of the early centuries. And that's a very healthy development, and one which kind of changes our perspective. But what is left out is the Middle East. The Syriac, and Syriac, of course, is the third great Christian language. Paul goes to Damascus, but who ever talks about Christians in Damascus? And you enter then into a mission effort as it spreads east that is of a completely different character, and it's in a Semitic language. So this then becomes the third great region. Egypt is on the edge of that world, and we do have a certain amount of interest in the Copts, but it's more Egypt in the Coptic language and the Gnostics. the people who kind of move over into that, coming out of New Testament, early Christianity, they're not really interested in Shanut, the great Coptic monk. They're not interested in Benjamin, who was the patriarch of Constantinople, of Alexandria, at the time of the Muslim invasions. It's a very, very limited sense of it. But that's just the beginning. Armenia, Georgia, Ethiopia, Nubia, Sudan, south of Egypt, Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, India, and China. I have in here, among the pictures, a gold plate with scenes from the Gospels, which comes from, is it Uzbekistan or Tajikistan? There were people in that part of the world who embraced Christianity in the Syriac language, and Syriac was the language which transmitted it. We have a wonderful set of documents that show us that just as they used the Psalms to learn Latin for people who didn't speak Syriac, they spoke Sogdian, I think was the language. So in Central Asia, they learned the Psalms in Syriac so they could speak a language which then carried on the Christian tradition. And the important point is this, is that once the spread of Christianity outside the empire becomes part of the story, one comes face to face with the deep, pervasive linguistic and cultural diversity of Christianity. And we begin to realize that there are at least 3 centers: Rome, Constantinople, and Baghdad. In fact, I was astounded. That was where the Catholicos, the patriarch of what came to be called the Church of the East, lived. And at a council, the bishops, Syriac-speaking bishops from that part of the Christian world, invoked the words of Christ, "On this rock I will build my church," to refer not to the Bishop of Rome, but to the Bishop of Baghdad, Seleucus Ctesiphon. They say, he is our Peter. This story has not been told. It's been told in specialized works, but it's not been told as a general history. And the significant thing about it is that these are not people, as the generations go by, who are waiting for orders from Constantinople or Alexandria or Rome. They're running their own show, and they know they are. For example, married clergy, in some cases, you know. Now, because the founding documents are Greek, and early Christianity moved in a Greek-speaking world, and then Latin very quickly came on. By the year 200, you were getting some things in Latin. And because that's part of our Western cultural heritage, we kind of take that for granted. But we don't realize that there are several other linguistic worlds that belong to Christianity. And so all of these people, they had to translate into their language. This was the missionaries done in the 19th century and the 20th century. The Bible, the liturgy, prayer books, lives of the saints, theological terms. And those of us who have studied languages realize it makes an enormous difference when you put a phrase or a category into another language. All of a sudden it has overtones. I'll give you a couple of illustrations. One of the most interesting is in Armenia. Armenia, of course, is north of Syria. It's over toward the Caspian Sea. And so Christianity spread there in Syriac first. But the people didn't speak Syriac. And so there was a man by the name of Mashtots. Some of you probably know him. And he knew that they had to translate so they could read the Bible when they got together for worship in their language. But there was no alphabet. And so they wrote it in Syriac letters, but that wasn't adequate. And so he decided he would try to translate. And he tried using Syriac letters to translate Armenian, but after they then translated some things, they realized it didn't work. So he was kind of perplexed, and as the story goes, or as we would say, as it has been handed on to us, he had a vision of the letters. And then he started writing them down, but he was a wise man. He went to a calligrapher, and the calligrapher helped him to shape the letters in a way which would make them legible. And so they began then to translate. And this is probably for me the most fascinating thing. The book of the Bible that they began with was Proverbs, a book of wisdom, first into Armenian. The other great language story is, of course, with the Slavic language. That's much more familiar. These two Greek monks who lived in Thessalonica, which was Slavic and Greek-speaking, and descends north in the Slavic-speaking people, and they have to create an alphabet so they can train, because the Eastern churches went to the vernacular, whereas the Western church made Latin the language of the rituals, not for preaching, but for baptism and Eucharist and so forth. And so they came up with an alphabet and translated, and that then formed the basis for the Slavic, Byzantine, Orthodox tradition. But once you translate into another language, you're not only conveying, transmitting a religious tradition, you're laying the foundation for the building of a new culture, a Christian culture, using the language. And I was, a year ago, just at this time, my wife and I, it was kind of a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. We went on a cruise of the Black Sea. Started in Istanbul and made a complete circle along the northern coast of Turkey to Georgia, and over to Russia, then into Ukraine, and then Romania and Bulgaria. And in Bulgaria, I was in a museum with icons. And I saw this large icon, and there were these two aged men with liturgical vestments on, and they're holding a pole. And then there's a banner on the pole. Now I figured, that's some biblical quotation. And I looked closely at it. I don't know much Russian or Bulgarian, and it was the alphabet. So if you want to talk about Christianity and culture, here were the two great, it was Cyril and Methodius, the two great founders of Slavic-speaking Christianity. And what are they displaying is not, in the beginning was the word or something of that sort, but the Slavic alphabet. And I was in New York at, I think, a First Thing event, and I got to talking with an Armenian, and I mentioned this to him. He says, "Oh, we got one like that too." And sure enough, he says it to me online, and they had the same blasted thing, the Armenian alphabet. Okay, so what this means, not only that Christianity is very diverse, culturally and linguistically, but it's not simply a religion. I think that's harder for probably people who come out of your tradition to recognize. I won't speak for you. The planting and growth of Christian communities always leads to the remaking of cultures. happened in the ancient world and the creation of a new civilization. Now, if you actually analyze your own tradition, you would have to say, well, we've been doing the same thing too. We are creating a culture. But we probably don't understand it that way. Maybe other people didn't understand it that much. But this preoccupation with putting things into the language. And so what happened was not only one new civilization, but several. Christianity is a culture-forming religion with art, architecture, music, institutions, hospitals. I got a whole chapter here on Basel, in the first hospital Christian bishop established. Laws, holy places, language, ritual. But the interesting thing about Christianity's relation to culture is that it's a two-way interaction. It isn't that Christians just shape the culture, it's that it is shaped by the culture. And there's been a long debate about the Hellenization of Christianity. Otto von Harnack, long dead. But that was largely concerned with ideas, Greek philosophical ideas. But what's much more important is tangible material objects, artifacts, Roman lamps, pictures, buildings, laws, music, practices, language. For example, talking about aha experience, maybe some of you have seen this icon. It's an Egyptian Coptic icon. Christ in Minas, he's an Egyptian monk. Christ had his arms around Minas. Well, I was writing the chapter on Coptic Christianity and reading something, and all of a sudden I come across some pictures, and lo and behold, the picture was of the Egyptian god Anubis with the dog face, and he's got his arm around somebody just like Jesus here. And it was a funerary picture, and he was sending him off into the netherworld, and Osiris, another Egyptian god. And I said, my goodness. I said, that's what that is. That's Christian. I mean, it's Egyptian, it's not Christian. But they made it into a Christian thing. And that happens again and again. There are others that you know of, the Blessed Virgin and so forth. Or another one. This again was, for me, we know nothing about ancient Nubia, but there was a great archaeological dig before the Aswan Dam. And they found these magnificent frescoes. I think it was a 9th century Nubian Christian church. And what I found as I started looking at those, you have the white face of St. Peter, and you have the black face of the Nubian bishop. You know, as if the icon painter, it's a fresco on a wall, saying, we don't have to picture people the way they think they might have looked over in Palestine. I mean, paint them the way they are. And there's another one here where you've got a dark-skinned Nubian queen, and next to it the Virgin Mary with the white face. And that happens, again and again and again. Take architecture. I mean, I'm sure many of you know this. When the Christians began to build churches, they didn't go for the temple. The temple didn't work because the temple was where you had the statue of the god, and the sacrifice, the religious rite took place out in front. They went for the basilica, which was basically a hall. You could have law courts, you could have a market there, you could have money changing, you could have all sorts of things there. So that then became the Christian typical building. Or another case, this is not a question so much of the trend, but I'm interested in music, and it was Christian monks who invented the stave, that is the musical staff. And why did they do it? Because there was no way to teach someone a melody without singing it. There was no way to write it down. There had been a rudimentary method earlier on, but basically it had died. And so some monks, 9th century Gaul, came up with the idea of having these lines and then putting marks there so you could tell what the pitches were. And the Pope heard about it, and he asked this monk to come to Rome, and he shows him what he's got, and he asks the Pope, why don't you then sing it? And after the Pope sings it, he says, my goodness, I was able to sing it without having heard it. That's what makes Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, the whole gang. So, all right. Another thing that's important, and I was very much impressed by this, the adoption of Christianity led to the formation of a new public space. A new public space. I'll use my friend Richard Newhouse's, the new public square. That is, conversion was not a matter of the warming of the heart. And the book by Alfred Darby Knock, is just American kind of Protestant account that's what conversion with Christianity brought. No, conversion was not the reorientation of the soul of an individual, not a conscious turning. It was moving into a new world with different buildings, different language, different rituals. It meant the conversion and Christianization of space and time. The marvelous book on this is The Conversion of the Barbarians by Fletcher. And I really learned that from that particular book. That Christianity, because you take in a whole people, walk them through the river, baptize them. No change of heart. That's going to take generations. And that has a lot of implications, I think, for the mission field. A nice book by Marcia Collett. She's a really fine medievalist on baptism. And she talks about what's called fictive baptism, imaginary baptism. And she refers that then to modern times, what are called rice Christians. That is, some are drawn to baptism for access to medical, educational, or economic benefits offered by membership in the community. They're rice Christians because they submit to the ritual of baptism without moral or spiritual conversion. I don't think that's all bad at all. It brings people into a different world. There was an article in the in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, maybe I mentioned this, about Christians beginning to convert in Germany. Muslims beginning to convert to Christianity in Germany. And I checked out the article, and some of the people say, well, they're just doing this because they want to stay. Well, that's fine. That's the way it's happened in the past. I mean, there were huge economic and cultural advantages to get into the Christian world. But then you build, and it takes generations then for it to become deep, but then it produces something. Another thing that I realized was the importance of institutions. I was struck with Keith when you were giving the things in the early church, and you probably would have gone on to it, but one of the most important things that happened in the first 2 centuries was the development of an institutional structure through the office of the bishop. It wasn't all a question of doctrine and teachings and so forth. And this is something that I think Protestants have to recognize. There is no enduring Christianity in the first 1,000 years without the bishop. Zilch. And so when a new part of the world came into, the king would then call back to the Roman Empire, and they would send a bishop. And that's very significant, you know, as to whether the office of bishop is so deeply rooted in Christianity that Protestants have to come to terms with that. The second thing, there is no flourishing Christianity without monks. And the monks are not only, and maybe even not primarily, solitaries. It became communal and social. It became an integral part of the community, the civil community, or the civic community, in Ireland, in Egypt, the Middle East. It was very adaptable. And this doesn't apply. There was no spread of Christianity outside the Roman Empire without the support of the king, because it came from the top down. I'd like to remind my friend Stanley Harwas in his polemic against Constantinianism. Stanley, you wouldn't have been here if there hadn't been for these kings and princes and emperors. The church would never have made its way without the support of kings. And in the Reformation would never have made its way without the support of kings. Much more political. What am I doing here? I've got to move along. Islam. Once one's gaze is turned east, you got to think about Islam. And I made a self-conscious decision in writing this book to I have 4 chapters on Islam and the rise of Christianity in the Muslims. I wanted to have one chapter that told in a sympathetic way the rise of Muhammad and the rise of Islam, and then to go through the various countries and see. And what you realize is that Christianity has been in deep, deep relation with Islam for centuries, and has been very much influenced by it. And there the language question became very problematic, because it wasn't that you were going into a culture that was pagan. You were going into you were now going to be in a religious culture, and it had many of the same biblical elements. So the question was whether you use the Arabic religious or Quranic terms to translate Christian categories. There was such a thing as the name for God. And Christians, and very wise, said Allah. That's the Arabic word for God. You don't come up with something different. That would have been really foolish. But the language question came up again and again and again in Spain. As Muslims, as Islam really settled in, Christians began to give up Latin. So there was a huge kind of resistance to that, especially on the part of the monks, because without Latin they had no access to the earlier texts, to the tradition. And it's extraordinary, the first translation of the Quran into Latin was done in Spain by an Englishman who had come to Spain because that's where he could really learn Arabic well. But once you talk about Islam, and now this is, I think, it comes to the present. The history of Christianity in most of the textbooks, Christopher Dawson being, of course, one of the primary figures here, is often seen as a tale of ineluctable progress and growth. It's onward and upward. But once one expands the history of the early centuries to the end of the first millennium and introduces Islam, things look much different, because there is a history of decline, attrition, and finally death. And the most tragic story, of course, is Greek-speaking Christianity in Asia Minor, where all the great guides come, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, Basil, and so forth. And we have all this browbeating about the Crusades, which didn't have any impact on Islam. That's just a lot of Western idiocy in the 19th and 20th century. Poor Arabs, going beating up on the poor Arabs. But the Turks beat up on the poor Christians. And they basically destroyed Christianity. And they were doing it up until the 20th century with the birth of the Turkish Republic. And we had this cruise last year. We went to a monastery. No, I don't know, 1915, 1920. Get out. None of these people had ever been to Greece. Get out. This is going to be a Turkish nation. So we have no... and of course, this is a problem in other parts of the world. Because Islam, for all of its faults, once it arrives, it stays. Christianity is more like a storm. Comes and it passes. And now, with what's happened in the last 5 years in Iraq and Syria, that most precious part of our heritage is going to be gone. There'll only be a handful of Middle Eastern, Syriac, or Arabic-speaking Christians. And it begins to appear, and now with all the immigrants moving into Europe, the chances that they will convert is, that's probably very slim, is that Christianity doesn't have much future in Europe. In North Africa and the Middle East, the arrival of Islam means a decline and disappearance of Christianity. I once went to spend some time, wanted to see the archaeological sites in Tunisia, and I realized in Tunis that the only place you could go to church was the French-speaking church, which had come when the French were there. There was no historic links to African Christianity, the world of Augustine and Cyprian and Tertullian. None of it. I have to get to an end here, so you're going to ask some questions. Another thing you learn in going through the whole history is that Christianity did not grow from a center. Very significant. Rome's not the center of the story. The vitality and the energy was on the periphery. There was energy, of course, at the center. In his really nice little book, Mark Noel, From Every Tribe and Nation, it was reviewed, I think, by Jenkins in a recent number of First Things. He says what was the case in the past is now happening again, that people are now facing issues and giving solutions to them, and they are not going to be told what to do by the Western churches. That's becoming more and more apparent. So the extensive growth of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, including China, there'll be a huge number of Christians in China. People are not going to say, what does Rome have to say, or Constantinople, or wherever it might happen to be? Churches on what was once the periphery are now going to make their own decisions. And just as the bishops of the Church of the East in Iran said they would no longer refer matters to the Patriarch in the West, Christians in other parts of the world. And that can be a very disturbing thing. And especially for Americans, especially for liberal Christians in America. Because the Christians in the other parts of the world, they are not prepared to accept Western values, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, that we are more readily to accept. We've assumed too long that Christian values and American values, they're not identical, but they certainly are complementary. But that has changed and the divide is growing. We have to learn in America that we are carriers of an ancient tradition that others are now carrying, and that we can learn from them. And we can be strengthened by them. As I said, some of the controversial issues. So I end with a statement from Andrew Walls. The conditions of African, Asian, Melanesian life, the intellectual climate of India, the political battlegrounds of Latin America increasingly provide the context within which the Christian mind is being formed. And I think that's the reality we are going to be living with in the decades to come. And you feel it definitely in the Catholic Church, because you've got really now well-established Catholic communities in Asia and Africa, and the bishops are well educated, and they're not going to bow to what the Germans say, or the Americans. And every communion has its own form of that. So let me read it again. The conditions of African and Melanesian life, the intellectual climate of India, the political battlegrounds of Latin America increasingly provide the context within which the Christian mind is being formed. Thank you.